Well, welcome to the first Wikipedia Wednesday of the year. We're going to start off the year with John Locke, because hoping the theme of the year is the reestablishment of liberalism as the cultural hegemon. Anyway, on to things. First, before that, comment below, as always, whoever you'd like to see a Wikipedia Wednesday done on, because you'd rather not read their page yourself. Gotta be interesting, though. So let's go here. John Locke was an English philosopher and physician, widely regarded as one of the most influential of the Enlightenment thinkers, and commonly known as the father of liberalism. Considered one of the British empiricists, following the tradition of Sir Francis Bacon, he is equally important to social contract theory. His work greatly affected the development of epistemology and political philosophy. His writings influenced Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, many Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, as well as the American revolutionaries. His contributions to the classical republicanism and liberal theory are reflected in the United States Declaration of Independence. Locke's theory of mind is often cited as the origin of modern conceptions of identity and the self, figuring prominently in the work of later philosophers such as David Hume, Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant. Locke was the first to define the self through a continuity of consciousness. He postulated that at birth, the mind was a blank slate or tabula rasa, contrary to Cartesian philosophy based on pre-existing concepts. He maintained that we are born without innate ideas, and that knowledge is instead determined by experience, derived from sense perception. Knowledge, sure. Yeah, okay, fair. Gotta go reread that theory. This is now known as empiricism. An example of Locke's belief in empiricism can be seen as, quote, "Whatever I write, as soon as I discover it not to be true, my hand shall be the forwardest to throw it into the fire." Weird. Fucking English. This shows the ideology of science and his observations in that something must be capable of being tested repeatedly, and that nothing is exempt from being disproven. Challenging the work of others, Locke is said to have established the method of introspection, or observing the emotions and behaviors of oneself. It's a strange thing to have innovated. Gotta stay practiced at this. Been like a month. Dyslexia's getting the better of me here. Life and work. Locke's father, also called John, was a country lawyer and clerk to the Justice of the Peace in Chew Magna, who had served as a captain of cavalry for the parliamentarian forces during the early part of the English Civil War. His mother was Agnes Keene. Both parents were Puritans. Locke was born on the 29th of August, 1632, in a small thatched cottage by the church in Ryton, Somerset, about 12 miles from Bristol. He was baptized the same day. Soon after Locke's birth, the family moved to the market town of Pensford, about 7 miles south of Bristol, where Locke grew up in a rural Tudor house in Belluton. In 1647, Locke was sent to the prestigious Westminster School in London under the sponsorship of Alexander Popham, a member of Parliament and his father's former commander. After completing studies there, he was admitted to Christ Church, Oxford, in the autumn of 1652 at the age of 20. The dean of the college at the time was John Owen, vice-chancellor of the university. Although a capable student, Locke was irritated by the undergraduate curriculum of the time. He found the works of modern philosophers such as René Descartes more interesting than that of the classical material taught at the university. Through his friend, Richard Lauer, whom he knew from the Westminster School, Locke was introduced to medicine and the experimental philosophy being pursued at other universities and in the Royal Society. at other universities and at the Royal Society, of which he eventually became a member. Locke was awarded a bachelor's degree in February 1656 and a master's degree in June 1658. He obtained a Bachelor of Medicine in February 1675, having studied medicine extensively during his time at Oxford and with such noted scientists and thinkers as Robert Boyle, Thomas Willis, Robert Hooke, and Richard Lauer. In 1666, the year of our Lord, he met Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, 1st Earl of Shaftesbury, who had come to Oxford seeking a treatment for a liver infection. Cooper was imprisoned with Locke and persuaded him to become part of his retinue. Locke had been looking for a career, and in 1667 moved to Shaftesbury's home in Exeter House in London to serve as Lord Ashley's personal physician. In London, Locke resumed his medical studies under the tutelage of Thomas Sydenham. Sydenham had a major effect on Locke's natural philosophical thinking, an effect that would become evident in An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Locke's medical knowledge was put to the test when Shaftesbury's liver infection became life-threatening. Locke coordinated the advice of several physicians and was probably instrumental in persuading Shaftesbury to undergo surgery, then life-threatening itself, to remove the cyst. Shaftesbury survived and prospered, crediting Locke with saving his life. During this time, Locke survived as secretary of the Board of Trade in Plantations and secretary to the Lord Proprietor of Carolina. Quite the title, which helped to shape his ideas of internal trade and economics. Shaftesbury, as a founder of the Whig movement, exerted great influence on Locke's political ideas. Locke became involved in politics when Shaftesbury became Lord Chancellor in 1672. Following Shaftesbury's fall from favor in 1675, Locke spent some time traveling across France as tutor and medical attendant to Caleb Banks. He returned to England in 1679, when Shaftesbury's political fortunes took a brief positive turn. Around this time, most likely at Shaftesbury's prompting, Locke composed the bulk of the two treatises of government, which it was once thought that Locke wrote the treatise to defend the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Recent scholarship has shown that the work was comprised well before this date. The work is now viewed as a more general argument against absolute monarchy, particularly as espoused by Robert Filmer and Thomas Hobbes, and for individual consent as the basis of political legitimacy. Although Locke was associated with the influential Whigs, his idea about natural rights and the government are today considered quite revolutionary for that period in English history. Locke fled to the Netherlands in 1683 under strong suspicion of movement in the Rye House plot, involvement in the Rye House plot, although there is little evidence to suggest that he was directly involved in the scheme. The philosopher and novelist Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein argues that during his 5 years in Holland, Locke chose his friends from among the same free-thinking members of dissenting Protestant groups as Spinoza's small group of loyal confidants. Baruch Spinoza died in 1677. Locke almost certainly met men in Amsterdam who spoke of the ideas of that renegade Jew who insisted on identifying himself through his religion of reason alone, while she says that Locke's strong empiricist tendencies would have disinclined him to read a grandee metaphysical work such as Spinoza's Ethics. In other ways, he was deeply receptive to Spinoza's ideas, most particularly to the rationalist's well-thought-out argument for political and religious tolerance and necessity of the separation of church and state. In the Netherlands, Locke had time to return to his writing, spending a great deal of time reworking the essay and composing the letter on tolerance. Locke did not return home until after the Glorious Revolution. Locke accompanied William of Orange's wife back to England in 1688. The bulk of Locke's publishing took place upon his return from exile. His aforementioned essay concerning human understanding, the two treatises of civil government, and a letter concerning toleration, all appearing in quick succession. Locke's close friend, Lady Masham, invited him to join her at Masham's country house in Essex. Although his time there was marked by variable health from asthma attacks, he nevertheless became an intellectual hero of the Whigs. During this period, he discussed matters with such figures as John Dryden and Isaac Newton. Oh, hanging out with Isaac Newton and John Locke. He died on October 28th, 1704, and is buried at the churchyard of the village of High Laver, east of Harlow in Essex, where he had lived in the house of Sir Francis Masham since 1691. Locke never married nor had children, and those brilliant genes gone. God damn it. Probably gay, I guess. Events that happened during Locke's lifetime include the English Restoration, the Great Plague of London, and the Great Fire of London. He did not quite see the Act of Union of 1707, though the thrones of England and Scotland were held in personal union throughout his lifetime. Constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy were in their infancy during Locke's time. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Locke's two treatises were rarely cited. Historian Julian Hoppet said of the book, "Except among some Whigs, even as a contribution to the intense debate of the 1690s, it made little impression and was generally ignored until 1703, though in Oxford in 1695 it was reported to have made a great noise." John Kenyon, in his study of British political debate in 1689 to 1720, has remarked that Locke's theories were mentioned so rarely in the early stages of the Glorious Revolution up to 1692, and even less thereafter, unless it was to heap abuse on them, and that no one, including most Whigs, were ready for the idea of a notion or abstract contract of the kind adumbrated. Fuck that word. We're ready for the idea of a notion or abstract contract of the kind adumbrated by Locke. In contrast, Kenyon adds that Algernon Sidney's discourses concerning government were certainly much more influential than Locke's two treatises. In the 50 years after Queen Anne's death in 1714, the two treatises were reprinted only once, except in collected works of Locke. However, with the rise of American resistance to British taxation, the second treatise gained a new readership. It was frequently cited in the debates in both America and Britain. The first American printing occurred in 1773 in Boston. Locke exercised a profound influence on political philosophy, in particular on modern liberalism. Michael Zuckert has argued that Locke launched liberalism by tempering Hobbesian absolutism and clearly separating the realms of church and state. He had a strong influence on Voltaire, who called him Le Sage Locke. His arguments concerning liberty and the social contract later influenced the written works of Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and other founding fathers of the United States. In fact, one passage from the second treatise is reproduced verbatim in the Declaration of Independence. the reference to a long train of abuses. Such was Locke's influence on that Thomas Jefferson wrote, Bacon, Locke, and Newton. I consider them as the three greatest men that have ever lived, without exception, and having laid the foundation of those superstructures which have been risen in the physical and moral sciences. So I guess I've done Newton. Got to get Bacon on my list. Thumbs up for Bacon. Who likes bacon? I like bacon. But Locke's influence may have been even more profound in the realm of epistemology. Locke redefined subjectivity, or self, and intellectual historians such as Charles Taylor, Jared Siegel argue that Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding marks the beginning of the modern Western conception of the self. Locke's theory of association heavily influenced the subject matter of modern psychology. At the time, the empiricist philosophers' recognition of the two types of ideas, simple and complex ideas, more importantly, their interaction through associationism, inspired other philosophers, such as David Hume and George Berkeley, to revise and expand this theory and to apply it to explain how humans gain knowledge in the physical world. I'm trying to trip over myself a little here. Locke, writing his letters concerning, I guess I should title this, Theories of Religious Tolerance. Locke, writing his letters concerning toleration in the aftermath of the European wars of religion, formulated a classic reasoning of religious tolerance. Three arguments are central: earthly judges, the state in particular, and human beings generally cannot dependably evaluate the truth claims of competing religious standpoints. 2. Even if they could, enforcing a single true religion would not have the desired effect because belief cannot be compelled by violence. 3. Coercing religious uniformity would lead to more social disorder than allowing diversity. With regard to his position on religious tolerance, Locke was influenced by Baptist theologians like John Smith and Thomas Helwys. Probably you've heard that, but don't know how to read it. Who had published tracts demanding freedom of conscience in early 17th century. Baptist theologian Roger Williams founded the colony Rhode Island in 1636, where he combined a democratic constitution with unlimited religious freedom. His tract, The Blood Tenant of Persecution for Cause of Conscience, which was widely read in the mother country, was a passionate plea for absolute religious freedom and the total separation of church and state. Freedom of conscience had high priority on the theological, philosophical, and political agenda since Martin Luther refused to recant his beliefs before the deity of the Holy Roman Empire at Worms in 1521, unless it would be proved false by the Bible. Constitution of Carolina. Appraisals of Locke have often been tied to appraisals of liberalism in general, and to appraisals of the United States. Detractors note that in 1671, he was a major investor in the English slave trade through the Royal African Company. In addition, he participated in drafting the Fundamental Constitution of Carolina while Shaftesbury's secretary, which established a feudal aristocracy and gave a master absolute power over his slaves. For example, Martin Cohen notes that Locke, a secretary to the Council of Trade and Plantations, and a member of the Board of Trade, was in fact one of just a half-dozen men who created and supervised both the colonies and their inquisitive system of servitude. Some of his statements on unenclosed property as having been intended to justify the displacement of Native Americans. Because of his opposition to aristocracy and slavery in his major writings, he is accused of hypocrisy and racism, or of caring only for the liberty of English capitalists. Locke also drafted implementing instructions for the Carolina colonists, designed to ensure that settlement and development was consistent with the fundamental constitutions. Collectively, these documents are known as the Grand Model for the province of Carolina. Theory of value and property. Locke uses the word property in both broad and narrow senses. In a broad sense, it covers a wide range of human interests and aspirations. More narrowly, it refers to material goods. He argues that property is a natural right and it is derived from labor. In Chapter 5 of his second treatise, Locke argues that the individual ownership of goods and property is justified by the labor expected to produce those goods or utilize property to produce goods beneficial to human society. Locke stated his beliefs in the second treatise that nature on its own provides little of value to society, implying that the labor expended in the creation of goods gives them their value. This position can be seen as the labor theory of value. From this premise, Locke developed a labor theory of property, namely that ownership of property is created by the application of labor. In addition, he believed that property precedes government, and government cannot dispose of the estates of the subjects arbitrarily. Karl Marx later critiqued Locke's theory of property in his own social theory. Too bad he didn't have a decent economic one. Political theory. Locke's political theory was founded on social contract theory. Unlike Thomas Hobbes, Locke believed that human nature is characterized by reason and tolerance. Like Hobbes, Locke believed that human nature allowed people to be selfish. This is apparent in the introduction of currency. In the natural state, all people were equal and independent, and everyone had a natural right to defend his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Most scholars trace the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the American Declaration of Independence to Locke's theory of rights, though other origins have been suggested. Probably won't edit that out. Like Hobbes, Locke assumed that the sole right to defend in the state of nature was not enough, so people established a civil society to resolve conflicts in a civil way with the help from government in a state of society. However, Locke never refers to Hobbes by name, and may instead have been responding to other writers of the day. Locke also advocated governmental separation of powers, and believed that revolution is not only a right but an obligation in some circumstances. These ideas would come to have a profound influence on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Limits to accumulation. Also see Lockean proviso. That sounds way cooler. According to Locke, unused property is wasteful and an offense against nature, but with the introduction of durable goods, men could exchange their excessive perishable goods for goods that would last longer and thus not offend the natural law. In his view, the introduction of money marks the culmination of this process, making possible the unlimited accumulation of property without causing waste through spoilage. He also includes gold or silver as money because they may be hoarded up without injury to anyone, since they do not spoil or decay in the hands of the possessor. In his view, the introduction of money eliminates the limits of accumulation. Locke stresses that inequality has come about by tacit agreement on the use of money, not by the social contract establishing civil society or by the law of the land regulating property. That sentence wasn't right. In his view, the introduction of money eliminates the limits of accumulation. Locke stresses that inequality has come about by tacit agreement on the use of money, not by the social contract establishing civil society or the law of the land regulating property. Maybe Locke is aware of a problem proposed by unlimited accumulation, but does not consider it his task. He just implies that government would function to moderate the conflict between the unlimited accumulation of property and a more nearly equal distribution of wealth. He does not identify which principles the government should apply to solve this problem. However, not all elements of his thought form consistent whole. For example, labor theory of value of the two treaties of government stand side by side with the demand and supply theory developed in a letter he wrote titled "Some Considerations on the Consequences of Lowering of Interest and the Raising of the Value of Money." Moreover, Locke anchors property in labor, but in the end upholds the unlimited accumulation of wealth. On price theory. Locke's general theory of value and price is a supply and demand theory, which was set out in a letter to a member of Parliament in 1691 titled "Some Considerations on the Consequences of the Lowering of Interest and the Raising of the Value of Money." He refers to supply as quantity and demand as rent. The price of any commodity rises or falls by the proportion of the number of buyers and sellers, and that which regulates the price of goods is nothing else but their quantity in proportion to their rent. The quantity theory of money forms a special case of this general theory. His idea is based on money answers all things, Ecclesiastes. What? Or rent of money is always sufficient or more than enough and varies little by little. Locke concludes that as far as money is concerned, the demand is exclusively regulated by its value. Locke concludes that as far as money is concerned, the demand is exclusively regulated by its quantity, regardless of whether the money is unlimited or constant. He also investigates and determines the determinants of demand and supply. For supply, he explains the value of goods are based on their scarcity and the ability to be exchanged and consumed. He explains demand for goods is based on their ability to yield a flow of income. Locke develops an early theory of capitalization, such as land, which has value because it is constant production of saleable commodities. It brings in a certain yearly income. He considers the demand for money as almost the same as the demand for goods or land. It depends on whether money is wanted as a medium of exchange. As a medium of exchange, he states that money is capable of exchange to procure us the necessaries or conveniences of life, and for loanable funds. It comes to be of the same nature with land by yielding a certain yearly income or interest. Monetary thoughts. These are the most exciting parts. Locke distinguishes two functions of money: as a counter to measure value and as a pledge to lay claims to goods. He believes that silver and gold, as opposed to paper money, are the appropriate currency for international transactions. Silver and gold, he says, are treated to have equal value by all of humanity and can thus be treated as a pledge by anyone, while the value of paper money is only valid under the government which uses it. Locke argues that a country should seek a favorable balance of trade, lest it fall behind other countries and suffer loss in its trade. Since the world money stock grows consistently, a country must consistently seek to enlarge its own stock. Locke developed his theory of foreign exchanges in addition to commodity movements. There are also movements in country stock of money, and movements of capital determine exchange rates. He considers the latter less significant and less volatile than commodity movements. As for a country's money stack, if it is large relative to that of other countries, he says it will cause the country's exchange to rise above par, as an export balance would do. He also prepares estimates of the cash requirements of different economic groups: landholders, laborers, and brokers. In each group, he posits that the cash requirements are closely related to the length of the pay period. He argues that brokers, middlemen, who actively enlarge the monetary circuit and whose profits eat into the earnings of the laborers and landholders, have a negative influence on both personal and the public economy to which they supposedly contribute. The self. Locke defines the self as that conscious thinking thing, whatever substance made up of whatever spiritual or material, simple or compound, it matters not, which is sensible or conscious of start this over. The self. Locke defines the self as that conscious thinking thing, whatever substance made up of whether spiritual or material, simple or compound, it matters not, which is sensible or conscious of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness or misery, and so is concerned for itself as far as that consciousness extends. He does not, however, ignore substance, writing that the body too goes to the making of the man. In his essay, Locke explains the gradual unfolding of this conscious mind. In his essay, argument half hours where I start to trip, apparently. That'll piss someone off. All right. In his essay, Locke explains the gradual unfolding of this conscious mind, arguing against both the Augustinian view of man as originally sinful and the Cartesian position, which holds that man innately knows basic logical propositions. Locke posits an empty mind, tabula rasa, which is shaped by experience, sensation, and reflections, being the two sources of all of our ideas. Locke's Some Thoughts Concerning Education is an outline on how to educate this mind. He expresses the belief that education maketh the man, or more fundamentally, that the mind is an empty cabinet, with the statement, I think I may say that all of the men we meet with, 9 parts of 10 are what they are, good or evil, useful or not, by their education. Locke also wrote that the little and almost insensible impressions on our tender infancies have very important and lasting consequences. He argued that the association of ideas that one makes when young are more important than those made later because they are the foundation of the self. They are, put differently, what first make the tabula rasa. In his essay, in which both of these concepts are introduced, Locke warns against, for example, letting a foolish maid convince a child that goblins and spirits are associated with the night, for darkness shall ever afterwards bring with it those frightful ideas, and they shall be so joined that he can no more bear the one than the other. This theory came to be called associationism, and is strongly influenced 18th century thought, particularly educational theory, as nearly every educated writer warned parents not to allow their children to develop negative associations. It also led to the development of psychology and other new disciplines, with David Hartley's attempt to discover biological mechanisms for association in his observations of man. I'm just going to read that paragraph again because I think that's the home run here for our issue in our generation of the moment. This theory can be called associationism, and it strongly influenced 18th century thought, particularly education theory, as nearly every educational writer warned parents not to allow their children to develop negative associations. You're not a fucking victim. Everything isn't hurting you. Words aren't violence. I can't, like, that's 18th century thinking, and we've, like, didn't go forward. Fuck. Dream argument. Locke was critical of the Descartes' dream of the... Is that just a badly written sentence? Like, I feel like some of this tripping isn't me. Like, why is demand and supply and not supply and demand? I just wanted to trip every time I've said that earlier. Dream argument. Locke was critical of the Descartes' dream argument. His claim is that we cannot have physical pain in dreams as we do in waking life. I think I agree with that, but I don't really dream, so. Religious belief. Some more good stuff. Some scholars have seen that Locke's political convictions as deriving from his political... Starting off strong. Some scholars have seen Locke's political convictions as deriving from his religious beliefs. Locke's religious trajectory began as a Calvinist Trinitarianism, but by the time of the Reflections, 1695, Locke was advocating not just Socinian views of tolerance, but also Socinian Christology. All right. However, Wainwright, 1987, notes that in the posthumously published Paraphrase, 1707, Locke's interpretation of one verse, Ephesians 1:10, is markedly different than that of Socinians like Biddle, and may indicate that near the end of his life, Locke returned nearer to an Arian position, thereby accepting Christ's pre-existence. Not knowing what these arguments are makes this a weird thing to read. In fact, historian John Marshall suggests that Locke's view of Christ ended somewhere between Socinianism and Arianism. Locke was at times not sure about the subject of original sin. He was accused of Socinianism, Arianism, or deism, but he did not deny the reality of evil. Man was capable of waging unjust wars and committing crimes. Criminals had to be punished, even with a death penalty. With regard to the Bible, Locke was very conservative. He retained the doctrine of the verbal inspiration of the scriptures. The miracles were proofs of the divine nature of the biblical message. Locke was convinced that the entire content of the Bible was in agreement with human reason. The reasonableness of Christianity, 1695. Although Locke was an advocate of tolerance, he urged the authorities not to tolerate atheism, because he thought the denial of God's existence would undermine the social order and lead to chaos. That excluded all atheistic varieties of philosophy and all attempts to deduce ethics and natural law from purely secular premises. For example, man's autonomy or dignity or human flourishing. In Locke's opinion, cosmological argument was valid and proved God's existence. His political thought was based on a particular set of Protestant Christian assumptions. Well, sorry, fucker, you didn't get that choice. Wish not granted. Although, a later video I'm scripting, an argument I have, is that might agree with him a bit. It's not that everyone believes in God, but everybody's religious. Or I need to coin a new term. Chance to do that in a later video. Whenever I fucking get to it. Alright, in Locke's opinion, the cosmological blah blah blah. Locke's concept of man started with the belief in creation. We have been sent into the world by God's order. and about his business. We are his property, whose workmanship we are made to last during his, not one another's pleasure. What a great sentence, thank you. Like the two other very influential natural law philosophers, Hugo Grotius and Samuel Pufendorf, Locke equated natural law with a biblical revelation, since in their view both had originated in God and could therefore not contradict each other. As a philosopher, Locke was intensely interested in Christian doctrine, and in their reasonableness, he insisted that most men could not hope to understand the detailed requirements of the law of nature without the assistance of the teachings and examples of Jesus. Locke derived the fundamental concepts of his political theory from biblical texts, in particular from Genesis 1-2, the Decalogue, Exodus 20, the Golden Rule, Matthew 7:12, the teachings of Jesus, example his doctrine of charity, Matthew 19:19, the letters of Paul the Apostles, the Decalogue, and the letters. The Decalogue, 10 Commandments, puts a person's life and or his honorable reputation, i.e. honor and dignity, and property, under God's protection. Freedom is another major theme in the Old Testament. For instance, God's association in liberating the Israelites from Egyptian slavery in the Decalogue's prologue, where the precondition for the following commandments. Moreover, Locke derived basic human equality, including the equality of the sexes, Adam and Eve, from Genesis 1:26-28, the starting point of the theological doctrine of Imago Dei. Theological doctrine of Imago Dei. To Locke, one of the consequences of the principle of equality was that all humans were created equally free, and therefore governments needed the consent to be governed. Only when Locke had derived the fundamental aspects of his concept of man and ethics from the biblical text, life, equality, private property, etc., did he examine as a philosopher which consequences they had in the above-mentioned way. Following Locke, the American Declaration of Independence founded human rights partially on the biblical belief in creation. All men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke's doctrine that governments need the consent of the governed is also central to the Declaration of Independence. There is the end, ladies and gentlemen. List of major works if you want to read yourself some Locke. A Letter Concerning Toleration, 1689. 1690, A Second Letter Concerning Toleration. 1692, A Third Letter for Toleration. It'll be interesting to see the evolution of that over a couple of years. 1689, Two Treatises of Government, published throughout the 18th century by London bookseller Andrew Miller by commission for Thomas Hollis. 1690, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. 1691, Some Considerations on the Consequences of the Lowering of Interest and the Raising of the Value of Money. Love that title. 1693, Some Thoughts Concerning Education. 1695, The Reasonableness of Christianity as Delivered in the Scriptures. 1695, A Vindication of the Reasonableness of Christianity. Major posthumanist scripts. First Tract of Government. Second Tract of Government. Questions Concerning the Law of Nature. I'm not going to read all this extra text here. Essay Concerning Toleration. The Conduct of Understanding. A paraphrase in 1707. A paraphrase and notes on the epistles of St. Paul to the Galatians, 1, 2, and Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, and Ephesians. See also that other stuff. And there's some John Locke for you, ladies and gentlemen. Beauty. bacon maybe next week, unless I'm missing somebody else from my previous list that I want to get to. But comment below who you'd like to see in the future, and I'll add them to the list. Hoping to get 40 to 50 of these done this year, so most every Wednesday, but I'm unreliable as shit, and most of these have been posted on Friday, so ignore the title, I guess. Anyway, if you're still here for some reason, toss a thumbs up. Comment below, make fun of something I said. All that good shit. Chatelet.